Are clever cooking tricks only 70s housewives knew really forgotten? These simple tricks once stretched groceries, flavored casseroles, and kept busy kitchens running with care and thrift. What does it say about us that such everyday wisdom quietly disappeared? Oyster cracker toppers were one of those little tricks that 70s housewives leaned on to stretch both flavor and budget. Breadcrumbs were not always on hand, and store-bought toppings could be pricey or just out of reach, so oyster crackers became the solution. They were smashed or crushed and sprinkled over bubbling casseroles or stews, adding that extra crunch that made the dish feel complete. You might laugh at the idea today, but this was the kind of smart move that turned leftovers into something that felt like dinner instead of scraps. Kids would dig in without complaint, and husbands coming home from work thought it was just another fancy touch their wives had picked up. All it took was a small bag of crackers to dress up a whole pot of food, which meant one trip to the store could carry through an entire week of meals. They were also handy to keep around for soups, giving even the most basic broth that texture people craved. A clever cook in the 70s knew it was not about what you had, but what you could make it look and taste like. Mayonnaise chocolate cake sounds like the oddest pairing, but to a 70s housewife, it was a lifesaver. Eggs and oil were not always affordable or plentiful, and mayonnaise carried both of those ingredients in one neat jar. What might have started as a depression trick found new life in suburban kitchens where dessert could not be skipped. The mayo kept the cake moist and soft, which made it a reliable favorite even when pantry shelves looked bare. Housewives served it at birthday parties, neighborhood gatherings, and even slipped it into lunchboxes, and no one ever guessed the secret ingredient. The kids were thrilled. The neighbors thought it was genius, and all it took was one jar of mayonnaise. For a generation that had been raised on thrift and taught to make do, this was proof that simple pantry swaps could feel indulgent. It turned an ordinary chocolate cake into something special that lasted longer and stayed fresh even days later. What mattered was not telling anyone how it was made, because the taste spoke for itself. Iceberg lettuce boats looked like diet food, but they were actually a clever way to stretch expensive proteins. Housewives would hollow out big crisp leaves and fill them with cottage cheese, tuna salad, or chopped ham, making one head of lettuce feed a whole family. They appeared on diet plates in diners, but at home they were a showcase of thrift dressed up as something stylish. A tray of these boats made it seem like you had spent hours planning, when in reality it was just a matter of scooping and spooning. They were crisp, fresh, and cheap, which checked every box for a busy mother trying to keep meals interesting. Cottage cheese and canned fruit made them light enough for summer lunches, while ham or tuna made them hearty for a quick dinner. Guests thought they were trendy, kids thought they were fun, and husbands thought they were health conscious, which meant everyone went home happy. It was not about the lettuce at all. It was about the illusion that this was something fresh and new. That was the true genius of 70s cooking tricks, making ordinary food feel like a special creation. Leftover meatloaf sandwiches were nothing fancy, but they were a weekday miracle in 70s homes. Housewives knew that one meatloaf could stretch across several meals if handled wisely, and cold slices tucked between bread made school lunches go further. A slab of meatloaf with ketchup on white bread kept kids full, while thinner slices paired with mustard and onion became work lunches for husbands. It was not wasteful, it was resourceful, and everyone felt like they got something different, even though it was the same dish. Housewives often cooked meatloaf in bigger batches for exactly this reason, knowing that leftovers were not a burden but a solution. Sandwiches transformed last night's dinner into today's lunch, which was a small act of clever planning. Families saved money without ever feeling like they were missing out on fresh food. It was frugality disguised as convenience, which is why it stayed popular through the decade. The satisfaction of pulling a ready slice from the fridge and creating a meal in seconds was the reward for thinking ahead. The cheese ball party trick was a revelation in its time, and no holiday table was complete without one. Housewives mixed cream cheese with dried beef, scallions, or herbs, rolled it into a sphere, and coated it in chopped nuts to give it flair. It looked extravagant, but in truth it was inexpensive, easy, and endlessly adaptable. A few simple ingredients transformed into a showpiece that impressed neighbors and entertained guests. It became a centerpiece of cocktail parties with crackers lined neatly around it and guests breaking off pieces as if it were something gourmet. The trick was that it could be made hours or even a day in advance, saving time for the host. Housewives loved anything that made them look polished without spending too much money or labor. It was not just cheese, it was social confidence shaped into a ball. The 70s were full of gatherings, and this recipe proved that you did not need wealth to make a statement. Canned green bean bundles were as much about presentation as they were about thrift. Housewives took humble canned beans, wrapped them with strips of bacon, and baked them into tidy little packages that looked far fancier than the ingredients suggested. Suddenly, the cheapest vegetable in the pantry became a party dish. They were easy to pick up, easy to serve, and they made families feel like they were dining in style. Kids who might have turned up their noses at plain beans were suddenly intrigued by the crispy bacon wrapping. It was one of those recipes that cost very little but carried big impact. Guests assumed it was a restaurant-inspired dish, not realizing it came straight from a can. Housewives kept these tricks up their sleeves to add flair without adding expense. They were little bites of ingenuity that showed just how far simple ingredients could be stretched when creativity came first. Waffle iron hash browns were the answer to crispy potatoes without the mess of frying. Shredded potatoes pressed into the iron crisped on both sides at once, freeing housewives from standing over a skillet with popping grease. It was neat, quick, and just inventive enough to feel like a brand new dish. The trick spread quickly through kitchens and community cookbooks, turning a breakfast staple into a gadget-driven shortcut. Kids loved the crisp edges, husbands appreciated the speed, and wives loved that the cleanup was minimal. It gave old waffle irons new life beyond breakfast, which was a welcome bit of resourcefulness. The result was golden, crunchy potatoes that looked just as appetizing as fried ones, but with far less fuss. A housewife in the 70s might not have had time for extra steps, but she had plenty of cleverness to spare. The waffle iron proved that appliances could double as problem solvers when you needed them most. Grape jelly meatballs sound strange, but in the 70s they were the darling of every cocktail party. Housewives simmered meatballs in a sauce made from grape jelly and chili, creating a sweet and savory flavor that felt completely new. Guests were surprised by the unusual pairing, but one taste kept them coming back. They became a staple of potlucks and gatherings, feeding a crowd with very little effort. The sauce was cheap, the meatballs could be stretched with fillers like breadcrumbs, and the result felt festive. Housewives loved how little time it took to put together, and partygoers remembered it long after the evening ended. It was another example of a clever trick making use of common pantry items to create something memorable. Even today, people who grew up in the 70s remember those saucy meatballs with nostalgia. It was proof that daring combinations could win hearts when money and time were short. Miracle Whip salad dressing was a secret weapon in fruit salads and slaws, offering a tangy sweetness that regular mayonnaise lacked. Housewives relied on it when they wanted to make dishes stand out without adding expensive ingredients. Grapes, apples, or shredded cabbage tasted brighter when dressed in it, turning simple produce into something special. It became the dressing of choice for picnics and church suppers, with recipes passed around between friends. The balance of sweet and tangy fooled people into thinking it was a unique family recipe, even though it came straight from a jar. It was affordable, easy, and dependable, which was exactly what busy households needed. Miracle Whip was not just a condiment, it was a kitchen trick to make ordinary dishes taste fresh. It is the kind of thing that made 70s cooking feel both practical and playful at once. Stuffed bell peppers with rice were the ultimate thrifty oven dish. Housewives stretched a small amount of ground meat by mixing it with rice, tomato sauce, and seasonings, stuffing it all into colorful peppers. What might have been only enough for two became a meal for an entire family. Baking them together let the flavors mingle, turning cheap ingredients into a dish that felt warm and complete. It was filling, economical, and surprisingly impressive when placed on the table. Housewives knew that recipes like this were about more than saving money. They were about creating meals that carried pride. It became a regular weeknight dinner that required very little but delivered a lot. Families walked away satisfied, and the kitchen stayed under budget. It was a shining example of how thrift and flavor met in perfect harmony in 70s kitchens. Pineapple upside-down bundt cake was one of those whimsical desserts that instantly caught attention on a 70s table. Housewives already knew the appeal of the classic pineapple upside-down cake, but baking it in a bundt pan gave it height, curves, and a presentation that seemed far fancier than the ingredients suggested. Canned pineapple rings, bright red cherries, and sticky brown sugar glaze lined the bottom of the mold, so when it was flipped out, it looked like something pulled straight from a magazine. Guests thought it was sophisticated, but the truth was it took no more effort than the original recipe. It was a playful nod to the growing trend of bundt pans in every kitchen, where recipes could be repurposed for new shapes and styles. Housewives leaned on this trick whenever they needed to impress without the fuss of pastries or layered cakes. The cake looked polished, tasted rich, and had the bonus of stretching one can of fruit into a dessert that fed a crowd. It was a dish that celebrated presentation as much as thrift, showing how far creativity could take you. Powdered milk baking was one of those quiet tricks that kept households running smoothly when the weekly grocery money did not stretch far. Housewives discovered that adding powdered milk to bread, cookies, or cakes meant saving the fresh milk for children's glasses and breakfast cereals. The powdered version blended easily with dry ingredients, gave baked goods structure, and cost less per serving than cartons of fresh milk. It was a compromise that felt almost invisible, because once mixed and baked, no one could tell the difference. Some even claimed it gave breads a slightly denser crumb, which made sandwiches hold up better in lunchboxes. This practice turned powdered milk from a pantry backup into an everyday ingredient, one that showed just how resourceful homemakers were with substitutions. It was not glamorous, but it was practical, and it allowed mothers to stretch supplies without sacrificing family traditions like fresh cookies after school. Powdered milk became a symbol of thrift masked as normalcy, proof that cleverness often lay in the smallest details of a recipe. Almond gelatin squares were a light, almost playful dessert that felt exotic in 70s households. Housewives would flavor clear gelatin with almond extract, suspend canned fruit inside, and cut it into neat cubes for serving at luncheons or potlucks. The translucent look with jewel-like bits of peaches, cherries, or pineapple gave it an elegant appeal without the cost of bakery sweets. It was easy to make in bulk, chilled overnight, and sliced into squares that stacked prettily on serving trays. Unlike heavy cakes or pies, these desserts were refreshing, especially in warmer months when something light was welcome. Kids loved the wobbly texture, while adults saw it as chic, an alternative to the ordinary Jell-O salads of earlier decades. The almond flavor gave it just enough sophistication to set it apart, hinting at something European, even if it came straight from a box and a can. In homes where budgets were tight, almond gelatin squares were proof that thrift could still carry flair and charm. Frozen pea soup hack was the kind of shortcut that only a practical 70s housewife could have dreamed up. Instead of spending hours simmering fresh vegetables, she would simply blend a bag of frozen peas into a pot of cream soup. The result was an instant burst of color and sweetness that made it look and taste homemade without the time or expense. This trick turned a plain can of cream of mushroom or cream of chicken into something lively, green, and nourishing. Housewives leaned on it for weeknight dinners when schedules were packed with school, chores, and community events. Guests thought it was thoughtful cooking, but in reality, it was thrift and convenience at its best. Frozen peas were cheap, plentiful, and stored well, making them one of the most reliable ingredients in the freezer aisle. With one whirl of a blender, an ordinary soup became a dinner centerpiece, fooling both family and visitors alike. It was cleverness in a pot, served hot and steaming with bread on the side. Bologna salad spread was the unsung hero of thrifty sandwiches in the 70s. Housewives would grind leftover bologna, mix it with mayonnaise and pickle relish, and spread it onto white bread for an inexpensive lunch that tasted indulgent. It stretched meat further than slices ever could, making one package last several days. Children thought it was a treat, especially when tucked into lunchboxes with potato chips or carrot sticks. The spread had a tangy bite that felt different from plain lunch meat, and it became a signature flavor for many families. It was fast to prepare, easy to store, and endlessly adaptable, with some adding chopped onions or mustard for variety. In an era when waste was frowned upon, turning scraps into something craveable showed real ingenuity. Housewives understood that presentation mattered, and when cut into triangles or paired with crackers, this humble spread felt surprisingly polished. It was proof that resourcefulness could feed both bellies and pride without breaking the budget. Cracker Barrel cheese logs were the retro answer to snacking boards long before charcuterie became fashionable. Housewives would mix cheese with spices or herbs, roll it into logs, and coat it in paprika or sesame seeds for flair. Served with crackers, it became the highlight of parties and church gatherings, giving everyone something to nibble on without emptying the wallet. The appeal lay in its simplicity. It looked indulgent, but took little time or money to prepare. Rolling the cheese into a tidy log made it easy to slice, keeping everything neat and manageable on a tray. It was versatile, too, since nearly any combination of cheese and coating worked, making it a flexible solution when supplies varied. These cheese logs turned the ordinary into the memorable, showing off creativity in a way that seemed effortless. They were clever centerpieces that turned everyday pantry items into a conversation piece. Egg salad mold was one of those recipes that perfectly captured the adventurous spirit of 70s cooking. Housewives would combine chopped hard-boiled eggs, mayonnaise, and vegetables, suspend it all in gelatin, and set it in decorative molds. The result was a wobbly, colorful ring that was sliced and served at luncheons or holiday tables. While it might seem unusual today, at the time it felt stylish and impressive, a departure from plain bowls of salad. Gelatin molds were trendy, and turning egg salad into one gave it both structure and spectacle. It was a way to take the familiar and make it exciting without adding extra cost. Guests admired the presentation, while families enjoyed the familiar flavor hidden beneath the shine. For homemakers, it was another trick to prove that creativity could elevate even the humblest of dishes. Pineapple cheddar casserole was one of those quirky pairings that defined the era. Housewives mixed sweet pineapple chunks with sharp cheddar cheese, baked it into a casserole, and served it alongside ham or pork at Sunday dinners. The sweet and savory combination surprised many, but it quickly became a favorite in community cookbooks. It was thrifty, since canned pineapple was affordable and cheddar stretched protein-heavy meals further. The dish struck a balance between novelty and tradition, standing out at gatherings while still being comforting. Families came to expect it during holidays, and housewives relied on its dependable ease. Its charm lay in the way it transformed two ordinary ingredients into something unforgettable, sparking conversations at dinner tables across the country. Frozen orange juice cakes delivered brightness to even the simplest gatherings. Housewives discovered that concentrated frozen orange juice added zing to pound cakes, icings, and glazes, creating desserts that felt fresh without relying on costly produce. A spoonful of concentrate packed more punch than squeezing oranges, and it kept well in the freezer. Pound cakes livened up with orange zest became a crowd pleaser at potlucks and coffee hours. It was a shortcut that elevated simple baking into something memorable, proving that a small trick could carry big impact. Housewives cherished recipes that turned pantry staples into desserts that wowed guests, and this was one of the best. Cabbage soup diet trick was less about flavor and more about following trends. In the 70s, the idea of slimming meals took hold, and housewives leaned on cabbage soup as a quick fix. It was cheap, filling, and gave the illusion of progress when paired with diet plans of the day. Whole heads of cabbage simmered with onions, tomatoes, and broth became the base for a week of meals. While it was never glamorous, it fit the moment, when weight-conscious recipes filled magazines and cookbooks. Housewives shared variations among friends, sometimes dressing it up with spices or lean meats, but the essence was always thrift wrapped in health claims. It was one of those fads that reflected both resourcefulness and cultural pressure, standing as proof that even soups carried social weight. Bread crust pizzas were the cleverest way to make use of scraps that kids normally tossed aside. Instead of throwing crusts in the bin, 70s housewives would save them up, spread tomato sauce across the surface, sprinkle a bit of shredded cheese, and bake them until golden. What might have been waste became a tray of miniature pizzas, each one bite-sized and perfectly suited for after-school snacking. Children loved the novelty of holding something that looked like a pizza but fit right in their hands, and mothers loved that nothing was wasted. It was thrifty, filling, and quick to pull together on busy afternoons. Sometimes little toppings like sliced olives, pepperoni scraps, or even leftover vegetables were added, giving the illusion of a variety platter without ever buying extra ingredients. It was a playful way to stretch one meal into another, and for many kids, these little crust pizzas were remembered more fondly than the real thing. The satisfaction of turning discarded pieces into something craved was part of the charm. Celery leaf garnishes were one of those quiet tricks that might go unnoticed today, but meant a lot in frugal 70s kitchens. Instead of tossing the leafy tops into the trash, housewives snipped them up and sprinkled them over salads or stirred them into soups for a burst of color and flavor. The sharp, fresh taste of the leaves added brightness without costing a penny, and it gave dishes the look of careful planning when in reality it was just thrift at work. Every part of the vegetable had a role, and the leaves became a symbol of resourcefulness in meals that might otherwise feel plain. They were especially valued in broths or chicken soups, where their flavor was subtle but noticeable, lifting the dish without needing costly herbs. Guests thought it was a little flourish, a homemaker's personal touch, when really it was a way to stretch every stalk. It was a reminder that waste was never fashionable, and creativity was the true garnish of the era. Pickle roll-ups became a surprise favorite in lunchboxes and potlucks, and they proved how far simple pantry items could be stretched. Housewives would smear cream cheese across slices of deli ham, place a pickle in the center, and roll the whole thing into a tidy bundle. Once sliced into bite-sized pieces, they looked almost gourmet, despite being assembled in minutes. Children loved pulling them apart in lunchboxes, while adults popped them like appetizers at neighborhood gatherings. They offered a crunchy, tangy bite wrapped in something hearty enough to pass for indulgence. Cream cheese smoothed out the saltiness, while the pickle added both flavor and texture, making it a clever balance of taste on a budget. It was proof that fun presentation could make even the simplest ingredients feel party-worthy. A few slices of ham, a jar of pickles, and some cheese created a dish that stood out on any table. Leftover rice pudding was one of the sweetest ways to disguise yesterday's dinner into today's dessert. Housewives baked cold rice with milk, sugar, raisins, and a shake of cinnamon until it came out warm and fragrant, filling kitchens with comfort. It was the definition of resourcefulness, transforming something bland and unwanted into a dish that families looked forward to. The chewy raisins plumped in the milk, the cinnamon gave it a cozy spice, and suddenly, leftover rice felt intentional. This recipe stretched grocery budgets by ensuring no cooked grain ever went to waste, and it became a tradition in many homes. Children often requested it, not realizing they were eating the previous night's supper in disguise. Housewives treasured recipes like these because they brought joy without expense. Rice pudding was frugal, filling, and forgiving, adapting to whatever was on hand. It turned a basic staple into something sweet enough to remember fondly decades later. Orange Julius copycats were the mall treat that made its way into every thrifty household blender. Housewives learned that a can of frozen orange juice concentrate, blended with milk, sugar, and sometimes a splash of vanilla, created the same frothy drink without the trip downtown. Children begged for them after school. Husbands enjoyed them on hot afternoons, and neighbors saw them as proof that homemakers could replicate anything. The mixture was creamy, sweet, and refreshing, a little luxury that cost only pennies per serving. It was thick enough to pass for indulgent, but still light enough to feel wholesome, which fit perfectly with the health-conscious trends of the decade. Housewives clipped variations of the recipe from magazines and passed them around at church gatherings, each one swearing hers tasted just like the real thing. The magic was not just in the flavor, but in the feeling of beating the system, of making store-bought luxury at home. Saltine cracker pie crusts might sound like desperation, but they were actually ingenious. When graham crackers were too expensive or simply unavailable, housewives crushed saltines, mixed them with butter and sugar, and pressed them into pie pans. Once baked, they made a surprisingly crisp and sturdy base that carried fillings as well as any graham crust. This trick stretched dessert options and allowed pies to appear regularly on tables that might not have afforded them otherwise. The slight saltiness of the crackers paired well with sweet custards or fruit fillings, making the pies memorable in their own right. Children never knew the difference, and guests often assumed it was just another creative recipe passed down through family lines. It was yet another example of the ingenuity that marked 70s kitchens, where substitutions did not feel like sacrifice. Housewives knew that as long as it looked polished and tasted good, no one asked questions. Homemade cheese straws were crunchy, salty snacks that made housewives look like professional bakers without the effort. Strips of biscuit dough were twisted with cheese powder or grated cheddar, then baked until crisp and golden. They were served at bridge clubs, parties, and holiday gatherings, vanishing quickly from trays. Their appeal lay in their simplicity, a handful of ingredients transformed into something addictive. Children munched them with tomato soup, while adults paired them with cocktails, and everyone assumed they took far more work than they did. Housewives leaned on recipes like this to show skill without expense, because flour, cheese, and butter were always cheaper than buying packaged snacks. The straws were easy to shape into spirals or sticks, and they always looked festive on the table. For many families, they became the taste of togetherness, reminding everyone that a homemade touch carried more love than anything store-bought. Macaroni salad with Miracle Whip was the bright, tangy dish that seemed to appear at nearly every picnic, potluck, and backyard gathering throughout the 70s. Housewives would boil up generous pots of elbow macaroni, drain them, and then fold the cooled noodles into Miracle Whip instead of traditional mayonnaise. Chopped celery, diced onions, and colorful bell peppers were often added for crunch and freshness, making it both filling and cheerful to look at. The sweetness of the jarred dressing gave the salad a signature flavor that was instantly recognizable, and it was unlike anything made with regular mayonnaise. It felt lively and distinct, which is why people remembered it even decades later. This salad was cheap to make, easy to prepare in large quantities, and versatile enough to serve either as a side dish or as a simple light meal. Children happily scooped it cold out of the refrigerator, husbands paired it with sandwiches for lunch, and neighbors expected to see it sitting proudly on church supper tables. It was dependable, frugal, and endlessly adaptable, which is why it stayed in rotation for so long. For housewives, it was a guaranteed hit that required little more than pantry staples and one simple jar of Miracle Whip. Canned shrimp cocktails were the faux fancy starters that added a surprising sparkle of elegance to otherwise thrifty dinners. 70s housewives would chill small canned shrimp, portion them into neat little glass cups, and then ladle over a simple sauce of ketchup stirred with horseradish. It was bold to call it cocktail sauce, but presentation made all the difference, because to guests, it looked like something lifted straight from a restaurant menu. The truth was far humbler, since the ingredients were all inexpensive and easy to keep stocked in the pantry. Families felt indulged by the sight of those little cups. Children thought it was adventurous and exotic, and hosts could entertain guests without straining their budgets. What mattered most was not the origin of the shrimp, but the impression of sophistication that came with it. This dish embodied the 70s love of thrift, dressed up as flair, where appearances counted for more than cost. It was practical, impressive, and memorable, which made it a go-to recipe for countless households. Even today, many people recall the taste with nostalgia because it turned otherwise ordinary evenings into small celebrations that felt a little bit glamorous without the restaurant bill. Instant pudding frosting was nothing short of a revelation for busy 70s housewives who wanted cakes that looked polished without hours of work. The method was simple yet ingenious. Dry pudding mix was whipped into cold milk and then lightened with whipped topping, creating a frosting that was airy, fluffy, and indulgent. Unlike traditional buttercream, which required skill and time, this shortcut came together in minutes, making it a reliable choice for birthdays, school bake sales, or last-minute desserts. Cakes that might have seemed plain or store-bought suddenly looked bakery fresh, topped with soft peaks of sweet and creamy frosting that children absolutely adored. It was inexpensive, easy to store, and required only a handful of pantry staples, which made it especially appealing during years when budgets were tight. Housewives loved it not only because it tasted good, but because it freed up time for everything else that demanded attention at home. The frosting held its shape, lasted well in the refrigerator, and gave cakes a colorful, festive finish when tinted with food coloring. It was proof that clever kitchen tricks often outshone complicated recipes. In the end, instant pudding frosting was remembered as both thrifty and delightful, a true staple of 70s celebrations. The boxed cake mix plus pudding trick was one of the clever shortcuts 1960s moms swore by to make store-bought mixes taste homemade. Boxed cakes were affordable and convenient, but they often lacked the richness of scratch baking. The solution was to stir a packet of instant pudding mix into the batter, which added moisture, depth, and a tender crumb that stayed soft for days. Chocolate cakes became richer, vanilla cakes more fragrant, and even fruit-flavored mixes seemed more indulgent. This little hack quickly spread by word of mouth and appeared in countless community cookbooks because it was simple, affordable, and guaranteed success. Kids loved the texture, dads praised the flavor, and moms were relieved that they could deliver bakery-quality cakes with little effort. It was the kind of trick that made every birthday party, potluck, or Sunday dessert feel just a bit more special without costing extra time or money. Even decades later, bakers still use this 1960s secret to give boxed cakes an upgrade, proof of just how clever and enduring the trick really was. Shaping beef into steaks was one of those clever illusions that made dinners feel fancier than they really were. With a bit of seasoning and careful shaping, Grandma could take plain ground beef and press it into oval patties that looked like individual cuts of steak. Once browned in a skillet and topped with gravy or onions, they gave the impression of a hearty, steakhouse-style meal without the cost of real steak. For families who couldn't often afford higher cuts of meat, this trick was a way to enjoy the feeling of indulgence without breaking the budget. Kids grew up thinking they were eating something special, and in a way, they were. The special part was how much love and creativity went into making dinner stretch. The technique wasn't complicated, but it carried a sense of pride in serving meals that looked more extravagant than they were. Today, we call it Salisbury steak or hamburger steak, but the heart of it is the same, turning ground beef into something greater than the sum of its parts. It was resourcefulness wrapped in flavor, and it left memories stronger than the meat itself. Tamale pie with cornmeal crust was the Southwest's answer to a casserole, and it had attitude. The bottom was a savory mix of ground beef, onions, garlic, and chili powder, often with canned tomatoes or beans tossed in for volume. That got spooned into a deep dish. Then came the real star, a thick layer of cheesy cornmeal batter, sometimes spiked with jalapenos or creamed corn, poured over the top and baked until golden. When it came out of the oven, the cornmeal topping had puffed slightly, absorbing just enough of the sauce below to stay moist but never soggy. It smelled like campfire nights and school lunch lines. Tamale pie was bold, spicy, and comforting all at once. It let home cooks experiment with heat and seasoning, especially when taco kits were still new and exciting. You did not need to know how to make tamales to enjoy the flavor. Just beef, cornmeal, and some courage. The recipe showed up in Western and Southwestern cookbooks and made its way across the country in the back pockets of families looking for something different. It was not traditional, but it did not need to be. Tamale pie was its own thing, and that was more than enough. Burying food underground for natural refrigeration was one of the quiet genius moves that let Native American families survive through blistering summers and brutal winters alike. It sounds almost too simple now, but when done right, it was remarkably effective. By digging deep, shaded pits and lining them with grass, bark, or even cool stones, they created natural refrigerators that could keep vegetables crisp, fruits fresh, and even meat safer than leaving it above ground. There was an art to it, a dance with the seasons and the soil that few today remember. But the wisdom of making the earth itself your storage partner never truly faded. And when long journeys or harsh winters loomed ahead, native chefs had another brilliant solution for keeping their people nourished on the move, mixing wild berries, nuts, and hidden energy into one of history's first real trail mixes. Instant mashed potato magic was one of the most useful kitchen tricks of the 1960s, turning powdered flakes into more than just a side dish. Moms discovered that instant potatoes could thicken soups, stews, and gravies, giving meals extra body without requiring flour or cream. They could also be used as a base for croquettes or patties, stretching leftovers into entirely new dishes. As a side, they were quick, affordable, and surprisingly comforting when dressed up with butter or milk. The convenience of instant potatoes fit perfectly into the rhythm of busy households, where time was short but expectations for hearty meals remained high. This clever use of a modern product showed how 1960s kitchens balanced tradition with innovation. Even if some considered them a shortcut, they became a symbol of practicality and adaptability. Instant mashed potatoes were proof that even powdered food could be turned into comfort when guided by creativity. Using tomato soup as sauce was one of Grandma's simplest but most dependable shortcuts for flavor. With a single can of condensed tomato soup, she could take plain ground beef and transform it into a meal that was hearty, tangy, and comforting. The soup added moisture, preventing casseroles, skillet suppers, or even simple beef and rice dishes from becoming dry or bland. Its sweet, slightly tart taste gave the meal a richness that stuck in memory, tying dishes to the familiar red and white cans stacked in cupboards across America. Families grew up with that signature flavor, recognizing it immediately as the taste of comfort. For Grandma, it wasn't about cutting corners, but about using what she had wisely, and tomato soup was a pantry item that always delivered. With one can and a pound of beef, she could have a hot dinner ready that satisfied everyone at the table. Today, the trick feels nostalgic, but back then it was a piece of kitchen magic built out of practicality and care. Hamburger eggplant casserole was a post-war invention that came straight out of backyard gardens and budget-conscious kitchens. People grew eggplant because it was hearty, easy to harvest, and filled out a meal when meat was in short supply. The dish started with sliced, salted eggplant that was briefly fried or baked, then layered with cooked ground beef, tomato sauce, and breadcrumbs. Sometimes there was cheese, sometimes not. It all depended on what you had. The flavors were simple but filling: rich tomato, soft eggplant, and the unmistakable heartiness of seasoned ground beef. You baked it until it bubbled and browned on top, and by the time it hit the table, it looked like a home-cooked lasagna without any of the fuss. This was food you made when you had too many eggplants and not enough time. It was healthy by accident and thrifty by design. You could serve it as a main course or stretch it with a side of white rice. Either way, it felt like a proper meal. Hamburger eggplant casserole may not have survived the decades in style, but it never failed where it counted: in taste, texture, and the comfort of something hot at the end of the day. Adding instant potato flakes to thicken soups and sauces was a convenient shortcut, common in mid-century kitchens that simplified thickening without the need for flour or roux. This technique involved sprinkling dehydrated potato flakes into hot liquids to quickly achieve the desired consistency. The flakes absorbed liquid rapidly, thickening broths and gravies while adding a subtle, creamy texture. Betty Crocker's cookbooks recommended this method for its speed and ease, especially when time or ingredients were limited. It allowed cooks to rescue thin or watery dishes without extra cooking steps. This shortcut fit well with the era's emphasis on efficiency and resourcefulness in meal preparation. Using instant potato flakes also provided a gluten-free thickening alternative before awareness of dietary restrictions became widespread. This technique remains useful for cooks who want fast, reliable results when thickening soups or sauces. Using potato water to thicken soups and stews naturally was a clever and economical way to avoid flour or cornstarch as thickening agents. When boiling potatoes, the starchy water left behind was often saved and added to soups or stews to create a velvety texture without needing extra ingredients. Betty Crocker's recipes encouraged this practice as a resourceful method during times when pantry staples were limited or expensive. The potato water provided a subtle richness and body, enhancing the mouthfeel of broths and reducing waste in the kitchen. This trick was especially important during the Depression and wartime rationing, when stretching ingredients was essential. It also allowed cooks to keep recipes simple and gluten-free before dietary restrictions became widely known. The use of potato water as a thickener brought a natural creaminess to dishes, transforming humble soups into hearty meals. Today, many have forgotten this straightforward technique, but it remains a valuable, zero-cost way to improve soups and stews with minimal effort. Cabbage stretching ground beef dinners was a trick that spoke directly to the frugal heart of 1960s households. When a pound of beef was not enough to feed everyone, chopped cabbage was mixed in to bulk up dishes like skillet suppers, casseroles, or even soups. The cabbage softened as it cooked, soaking up flavor from the meat and seasonings, creating a dish that tasted heartier than it really was. This approach let moms serve generous portions while keeping grocery bills under control. It also provided extra nutrition, sneaking vegetables into meals that might otherwise have been light on greens. For kids, it often went unnoticed among the sauce and beef, while parents saw it as a clever way to make a single pound of meat stretch across an entire family dinner. This simple technique became a staple of Depression-era cooking and carried proudly into the 1960s, where thrift and tradition met modern convenience. It is one of those forgotten tricks that shows how a little cabbage could make all the difference when budgets were tight. Cooking with onion soup mix was one of those mid-century hacks that made its way into countless beef recipes, and for good reason. The packets were cheap, shelf-stable, and packed with onion flavor that instantly transformed ground beef. Grandma would sprinkle it into meatloaf, burgers, or casseroles, and suddenly the dish tasted like it had been seasoned all day. The dried onion flakes added texture, while the seasoning mix brought a savory depth that was hard to achieve with just salt and pepper. For busy households, it was a shortcut that never felt like cheating, because the results were always so satisfying. Families grew used to the rich flavor it gave their meals, and the convenience meant it became a pantry staple in many homes. Today, with so many seasoning blends on the shelves, onion soup mix feels almost quaint, but it was once revolutionary in its simplicity. It proved that with a single packet, a plain pound of beef could be turned into something memorable. This trick was less about being fancy and more about being clever, and that's exactly why it became one of Grandma's sworn-by secrets. Cheeseburger macaroni loaf sounds like something out of a box, and it kind of was. This dinner came from a time when boxed pasta meals and processed cheese were part of every pantry, and ground beef was the weekly star. You would cook macaroni, mix it with browned beef and a block of soft cheese, then pack the whole thing into a greased loaf pan. After baking, you sliced it like meatloaf. What came out looked strange, but tasted like a cross between a diner burger and weeknight casserole. It held its shape well enough to pack in a lunchbox or reheat in a skillet with a little butter. Some families added ketchup or mustard to the mix, giving it an even more literal burger flavor. Others tossed in pickles or onions for texture. It was easy, filling, and did not require much more than a pot, a pan, and a little patience. Cheeseburger macaroni loaf was one of those meals that tasted better than it had any right to. It was not elegant, it was not even normal, but in the era of efficiency and post-war pride, it was exactly what a busy household needed: a whole loaf of dinner made to slice and share. Roasting root vegetables directly in campfire coals was one of the simplest yet most powerful cooking methods passed down through generations. Without ovens, pots, or fancy tools, native cooks understood that the earth's hidden foods, things like carrots, turnips, onions, and yams, could be transformed into sweet, hearty meals with nothing more than time and fire. Raw roots were buried in the hot, glowing coals of a dying fire, slowly roasting under layers of ash and heat. As they baked, their natural sugars caramelized, their fibers softened, and what once was hard and bitter became soft, rich, and deeply satisfying. Pulling a roasted root from the coals was like uncovering buried treasure, the skin blackened and crisp, the inside steaming and tender. And speaking of patience, some of the sweetest flavors ever created by native chefs required even longer waits, like gathering and boiling maple sap into a clear, nourishing water that tasted like spring itself. Softening stale bread with a damp paper towel and microwave was a quick fix promoted in Betty Crocker's cookbooks to restore freshness without baking. This technique involved wrapping the bread loosely in a damp paper towel and microwaving it for short intervals, creating steam that softened the crust and crumb. The method revived the bread's texture, making it more palatable for sandwiches or toast. It was a practical solution embraced by mid-century cooks to reduce waste and extend the usability of leftover bread. This trick saved time and energy compared to reheating in an oven and was particularly useful for small quantities. Betty Crocker's recommendation of this hack showcased the era's focus on efficiency and resourcefulness in the kitchen. While microwaves were not common in every home initially, the advice anticipated growing appliance use. The damp paper towel method remains a handy tip for anyone wanting to quickly refresh bread without fuss. Mayo in chocolate cake might sound strange to modern ears, but for 1960s moms it was a lifesaver when eggs and oil were too expensive or simply ran out. Mayonnaise was made from eggs and oil, so adding a spoonful to cake batter replaced both while making the cake incredibly moist. This trick became a secret weapon for birthdays, church gatherings, or any day when dessert was needed but the pantry was bare. The result was a cake so tender and rich that no one could tell it was built on substitution. Moms embraced it because it was practical, affordable, and foolproof, proving once again that resourcefulness could create results equal to or better than traditional methods. The mayonnaise cake became a beloved memory for many children of that era who associated it with celebrations even if money was tight. It was clever cooking at its best, born of necessity but remembered for indulgence. Frying leftover meatloaf as sandwich filler was one of Grandma's most clever ways to reinvent yesterday's dinner. She would slice cold meatloaf straight from the fridge, drop it into a hot skillet, and crisp it until the edges sizzled golden while the inside warmed through. Once tucked between bread, sometimes plain, sometimes toasted, it transformed into a hearty sandwich that felt brand new. A swipe of ketchup, mustard, or even leftover gravy turned it into a meal strong enough to rival anything from a diner. This trick meant leftovers never felt repetitive, and kids often had no idea they were eating yesterday's dinner. The crispy edges against soft bread made every bite memorable, the kind of flavor that stuck with you. For lunchboxes, it was a treat disguised as thrift, and many still recall the taste decades later. It was resourcefulness wrapped in comfort, proof that creativity made nothing feel wasted. Today, leftovers often get tossed aside, but back then they were opportunities. Grandma's frying trick showed that with just a little imagination, food could shine twice. Making a gravy base from beef drippings was one of the most practical and delicious habits Grandma swore by. After frying ground beef, she never just poured off the pan juices, they were too valuable to waste. Instead, she whisked in flour, maybe a splash of broth or milk, and built a flavorful gravy that could be ladled over mashed potatoes, bread, or noodles. This simple act turned a basic skillet of beef into a complete, comforting meal that stretched to feed more mouths. It gave dinners depth and warmth, making even small portions feel satisfying. Families relied on this trick not only because it saved money, but because it created flavor from what others might have discarded. The aroma of that sizzling gravy filled kitchens and promised a meal that was both hearty and resourceful. These days, we're often told to drain and discard fat for health reasons, but back then, every drop was an opportunity. That was the beauty of Grandma's cooking, knowing how to turn scraps into something rich, flavorful, and worth remembering long after the plates were cleared. Making fluffy rice by adding a pat of butter before serving was a finishing touch that added richness and enhanced flavor to simple steamed or boiled rice. This technique, recommended in Betty Crocker's cookbooks, involved stirring in butter just before serving to coat the grains, giving the rice a glossy appearance and a smooth, buttery taste. The addition of butter elevated plain rice from a basic side dish to a comforting accompaniment suitable for a variety of meals. This simple step also helped prevent the rice from clumping together, improving texture and appeal. The tip reflected mid-century home cooks' desire to make everyday dishes more enjoyable with minimal effort. Buttered rice fit well with the era's emphasis on richness and indulgence in family meals, especially when other ingredients were modest. This finishing touch continues to be a beloved way to prepare rice, combining ease and flavor in classic American cooking. Making fluffy mashed potatoes by adding hot milk gradually was a classic technique to avoid gluey or heavy mashed potatoes. Betty Crocker emphasized warming the milk before mixing it slowly into cooked potatoes, which helped the starches absorb liquid evenly and created a smooth, light texture. Cold milk shocked the potatoes and caused them to seize up, resulting in a dense and sticky mash. This technique was especially important when potatoes were a staple food and needed to be prepared just right to satisfy hungry families. The gradual addition allowed for better control over consistency and avoided watery or overly stiff results. While simple, it was a mark of good home cooking skill in mid-century kitchens. Rediscovering this trick can turn ordinary mashed potatoes into a creamy delight worthy of any dinner table. Bologna boat sandwiches were a playful invention that brought a little fun to lunchboxes and after-school snacks. Bologna was inexpensive and widely available, so moms looked for new ways to keep it interesting. By slicing a round of bologna and curving the edges, they created little cups or boats that could be filled with cheese, relish, or chopped vegetables. The result was a small, filling bite that felt more exciting than a plain sandwich. Kids loved the novelty of eating food shaped like boats, and moms appreciated that it was cheap, quick, and easy to prepare in batches. These little creations showed how 1960s moms understood the power of presentation in making ordinary ingredients feel special. They stretched lunches without adding cost and turned humble bologna into something memorable. Though they have disappeared from most tables today, they stand as a reminder that sometimes the cleverest kitchen tricks were also the simplest, making mealtimes just a bit more fun during a decade when families still gathered around the table every day. Binding with evaporated milk was one of those subtle secrets that most people never realized was happening behind the scenes. Canned milk was a pantry staple, always on hand when fresh milk couldn't be counted on, and Grandma knew exactly how to use it to improve ground beef. Adding just a splash into meatloaf or burger mixtures gave the beef a tenderness it wouldn't have otherwise. It softened the texture, made it more cohesive, and added a richness that made the dish taste like more than the sum of its parts. The slightly concentrated flavor of evaporated milk also enhanced seasonings, blending them through the meat in a way that felt balanced and smooth. For many households, it was an invisible step that made the difference between a dense, heavy loaf and one that cut easily and stayed moist. This was a time when nothing in the pantry went ignored, and canned milk was versatile enough to become a secret weapon in savory as well as sweet cooking. Today, we pass by evaporated milk without thinking, but in Grandma's kitchen, it was part of the quiet magic that made ground beef meals taste better than you remembered. The macaroni beef ring was more than just a recipe, it was a showpiece. You took cooked elbow macaroni and ground beef, mixed it with eggs and tomato sauce, and pressed the whole thing into a ring mold. After it baked and set, you flipped it onto a serving plate, and there it stood, a golden brown pasta wreath. But the real drama came next. The center of the ring was filled with creamed peas, buttered corn, or even leftover stew if that is what you had. It was the kind of dinner that turned heads at church potlucks or family dinners. Kids would laugh, adults would smile politely, and everyone would eat it anyway because it was surprisingly good. The pasta held together just enough to slice, and the beef gave it weight and flavor. Sometimes there was cheese mixed in, sometimes it was just seasoned with onion powder and salt. Either way, it was a clever use of pantry staples and leftover meat. The secret of grease preserves is one of those survival tricks that almost defies belief today. After cooking meat, Native American chefs would save every drop of rendered animal fat, pouring it carefully over shredded or chopped pieces of the meat inside clay pots or animal bladders. Once sealed, the fat hardened into a protective barrier that kept bacteria and air out, preserving the meat for weeks, even months. This was not just storage. It was insurance against famine, sickness, and scarcity. Meat preserved this way stayed rich, flavorful, and nutritious, providing vital energy when fresh food was impossible to find. Every time someone dipped into a pot of grease preserves, they were eating a lesson in patience, gratitude, and survival. But even the best preserved meat needed help lasting through long journeys or seasons, and sometimes the land itself offered the perfect cold pantry, hidden just beneath your feet. Turning river stones into griddles for perfect flatbreads is one of those ancient tricks so clever it almost feels like a fairy tale. Large, flat stones were carefully selected, cleaned, and then heated slowly over open fires until they held a consistent, even warmth. Once hot enough, balls of simple dough, made from cornmeal, acorn flour, or other gathered grains, were slapped down onto the stones. There were no skillets, no pans, just direct primal cooking at its purest. Even today, traditionalists who practice stone cooking say you can taste the river, the fire, and the earth in every bite. And back then, when every meal needed to last as long as possible, even cooked meat was treated like a precious currency. That is where one of the oldest and most ingenious preservation methods came into play, using nothing but animal fat and wisdom passed down through generations. Adding a dash of coffee to chocolate cake batter for richer flavor was a subtle but impactful flavor enhancer included in Betty Crocker's cookbooks. This trick involved stirring a small amount of brewed coffee or instant coffee granules into the chocolate cake batter, deepening the chocolate taste without overpowering it. The coffee intensified the cocoa's richness, producing a more complex and satisfying flavor profile. This tip was especially valuable when using cocoa powders that could be mild or flat in taste. It reflected the mid-century interest in maximizing flavors through simple ingredient tweaks. The coffee addition elevated a classic dessert into something memorable, delighting both casual and discerning eaters. Betty Crocker's inclusion of this hack encouraged experimentation and attention to detail in baking. This method remains a favorite for bakers seeking to amplify their chocolate cakes with a subtle twist. Creating mock mayonnaise with egg yolk and vinegar was a wartime-era hack that helped households cope when commercial mayonnaise was scarce or rationed. This clever substitute involved whisking egg yolks with vinegar, oil, and seasonings to mimic the creamy texture and tang of real mayonnaise. Betty Crocker's cookbooks offered this recipe as an affordable and easy alternative that required only basic pantry ingredients. The mock mayo kept salads, sandwiches, and dressings flavorful during tough economic times and supply shortages. It was particularly useful when fresh eggs and vinegar were more available than processed condiments. This homemade version might not have had the exact consistency of store-bought mayo, but it delivered the essential taste and moisture needed in classic recipes. Today, recreating this old-fashioned substitute can connect modern cooks to a resourceful culinary tradition that made simple ingredients stretch farther while keeping meals delicious and familiar. Vienna sausages wrapped in crescent dough were one of the era's most popular party tricks, combining frugality with fun. Crescent roll dough came in refrigerated tubes that made baking simple, while canned Vienna sausages were inexpensive and easy to keep on hand. Moms wrapped small sausages in triangles of dough, baked them until golden, and served them as appetizers that looked festive without requiring much money or time. These bite-sized treats felt indulgent at potlucks or parties, giving the illusion of abundance even when budgets were thin. Kids loved them because they were playful finger food, and adults appreciated them as a clever way to make canned meat feel special. They showed how presentation could elevate even the humblest ingredients, turning ordinary pantry staples into something worthy of celebration. Vienna sausages wrapped in crescent dough remain a nostalgic reminder of how 1960s moms brought joy and ingenuity to their kitchens, even when resources were limited. Freezing raw beef mixtures was a trick that made busy days easier long before the idea of meal prep had a name. Grandma would mix ground beef with fillers like oats, rice, breadcrumbs, or shredded vegetables, shape them into loaves, patties, or meatballs, and tuck them neatly into the freezer. When dinner time came, the hardest part of the work was already done. She could pull one out, bake or fry it, and have dinner ready in no time. This habit kept food from spoiling since fresh beef could go bad quickly, but frozen mixtures stayed safe for weeks. For larger families, this preparation was essential, allowing her to adapt quickly if unexpected guests showed up or if schedules got busy. Unlike store-bought frozen dinners, These meals were homemade, hearty, and full of care. The freezer became a quiet tool of stability in kitchens where planning ahead was survival. Those little parcels of beef weren't just food. They were foresight, comfort, and reassurance that no matter what the day brought, a warm, filling meal was always just within reach. Drop your favorite 70s trick in the comments, hit like if you laughed at one you forgot, and subscribe for more tasty blasts from the past.